First reactions, wow. Wow. Well, just to let you know, we're talking Jungle Cry.
Rugby. And we're going to make a team to play in the World Junior Rugby Championship.
This movie is really interesting. This movie came out in 2022. It released into festivals last year in 2021, but came out in 2022. It's directed by Sagar Ballari, and it follows a story of the U14's India championship team that came from the Kalinga Institute of Social Sciences. And they went to London to compete at the U14 Junior National Rugby Cup. It's an incredible story that I never even heard of until I just saw this movie. Happened in 2007. So this story actually starts off following the founder and director of the Kalinga Institute of Social Sciences, Dr. Samanta, played by Atul Kumar. And we run into the soccer coach, Rudra Singh, played by Abhay Deol. The interesting thing about this is this guy is already an established football coach. We learn that he's gathered these kids from different villages, deep villages around India to be able to come, get a great education, and to be able to play soccer and to be able to grow their world that way. But we actually enter in shortly after with Dr. Samanta coming in with a guy named Paul. All we get is his name is Paul. And Paul loves rugby. And Paul wants to teach rugby to the kids at the Kalinga Institute of Social Sciences. I'm just going to start calling it KISS, at KISS, because KISS is legit. The start of this movie, I almost was like, oh, okay, so, he's going to come in, he's going to save these kids from certain doom, and it's going to be all about him learning how to deal with these different cultures. But no, that's not the story of this. The story does not focus on Paul at all. In fact, the story is really about Rudra and the boys and Samantha and the people who actually are participating in the rugby. Paul and the rugby are simply vehicles. They're just simply gas to make sure that the story moves forward. But we really don't know much about them from this movie. Now, I will say, in full disclosure, doing further research, Paul, who is played by Stuart Wright, is actually a guy named Paul Walsh. We get his last name later on, but he's actually a former British diplomat to India who decided to quit his job as a diplomat to be able to go and help these underprivileged kids in India. And he's kind of actually has a relatively interesting story. Looking at him, I don't know how he survived India for all these years, but he did end up founding the Jungle Crows, which is the name of the team on here. Though in the movie, we call them the Jungle Cats, which, to be honest with you, actually sounds like a much more better, much more dope name. But I loved it for what it was on that. The thing that makes this movie so interesting is not because of the fact that it has a plot line that, you have your rise and fall. We know that, inspirational stories, but it's not the plot that's most important, but it was the perspective of the plot that really stood out to me on this one. And that actually, in my opinion, took it out of the generic range for it. We don't have a savior moment. There's no saviorism happening in this movie. It is simply about the ability to accept change, to be able to grow and develop, and to learn that there is sometimes more to the vision than what we even expect. And this isn't something that happens with both the soccer coach, Rudra, as well as the individual boys, and we get to learn more about them and their background. And then we also get to learn about Samantha and his process, and then we get introduced later on to Roshini Thakkar, played by Emily Shah, who is the trainer for these boys. And every moment that they had to use England as a savior moment, they didn't. I hate savior moments, but I like people coming in to help. Basically, what that means is it was not one person who turned around the whole idea that we get like in so many movies. But in reality, one person triggered an effect that allowed people to grow and develop. You get to watch their process, which is great. I give so much credit to the writers and the director of this. They made everybody who was not a part of that Indian squad an assistance to helping to drive that story. That is how you do it. In the world where we are, where we need to celebrate culture, various cultures in rugby, this is the way that you get it done. By shining a light on that culture and saying that culture is strong on its own. It has its traditions, and you get to see it. They show us the different traditions that they have in India through these characters. At no point is their culture diminished for this superior other culture or this more quote-unquote civilized culture. No, it's all civilized. It's just presented differently. And in fact, the confusions actually help even the assistance on it, which goes, I love it. To get to the plot, Paul comes in and tells them, hey, we have a junior national championship happening in London in 4 months, and we want to take these boys who have never heard of the game of rugby, never played the game of rugby, never even seen a rugby ball, and take them there to compete within 4 months. Insane. But this Dr. Samanta guy seemed to have the vision and wanted to see these boys be able to go to the international level, which, again, it is something that I feel, especially with rugby, needs to be preached more. I am sure people overseas and internationally from outside the U.S. see it more and are able to expand it more on the selling of being international. But even here in the U.S., I think it's super necessary to push the fact of having a vehicle and an objective and a reason to leave the country whenever you think your country has everything or you're just comfortable. But this movie was interesting because the style that they did this movie was almost 3 sets, 3 different kind of styles. Initially, I thought it was just going to be your straight, movie, kind of just give you the story and you just follow the story through. And to some extent, it's that. But then it becomes more of a documentary format where we talk to, albeit still played by the actors, talk to the main actors of this movie and they kind of speak about what happened before and how it impacted them and things. So we get a lot of flashback and kind of set up the background to the story through their recollection of what happened and how they got to that point in that time period. But then also at the same time, it also works almost like a narrative story overall. So outside of it just being a documentary, it's a kind of an expositional narrative. So the 3 layers of the movies, while I can be a little bit convoluting, I feel like was able to give us a full picture of how everything kind of impacted with itself. And you go and you learn about how these boys lived. From my experience from traveling through Southeast Asia and dealing with the NGOs there, this was really similar, where you have orphans and people who don't have a mother but have a father, people that have a father but don't have a mother, or people who have neither, just coming together and learning how to be strong together. And it's circulated around Rudra because he has to come to his terms of knowing that the plans that he originally had might not work. And the thing that has just newly been presented to him might be what the boys actually need, which I'm always an advocate for rugby over everything. So I like this aspect. Like who couldn't like this aspect there? But it was so meaningful. And then when these You get to watch their process. Another thing about this movie that I truly liked was the balance between rugby and actual character building. Because unlike a movie like Invictus, all right, which I talked about before, Invictus had more of the story was about what was happening outside. The rugby kind of drove into what the time period kind of giving us an idea of where everything was, and it was more of a marker. And of course, the action that happened inside of it was there. But if you didn't have the rugby inside, or you at least implied the rugby, you could still have that whole movie go on. With this movie, not only is the rugby a necessity, but it almost acts as another character development for the players themselves, because of the fact that they just let this thing play itself out for so much. So much of the character develops off of it. I was hopefully surprised at how much they allowed the rugby to continue to play. Because it was like watching the game itself. It was a little less dynamic than you would see in other rugby movies, other sports movies, but it felt more realistic. It felt like you were actually watching the game, which I think was the perspective that they wanted to get for this. My biggest negative that I did have with this movie, I felt like they tried to drive some emotional moments unnecessarily. There's a moment inside this movie where Rudra and Roshni kind of have a will they, won't they kind of moment. It felt a little bit like a forced love story that they were trying to put in where no love story needed to be done. Like, they were friends and they respected each other. It was great. She was a great advisor. She was great in it. She wasn't weak. She wasn't a damsel in distress. She was strong. She was nurturing. Roshni was great in this. But those forced emotional moments I thought was unnecessary. Even for her, they tried to create a character development arc for her, which I appreciate the idea, but I don't think that they did it well. They kind of made a mention and then they expanded on the idea, but how they kind of paid it off, I think was a little bit clunky. Though, again, it was meant to pull heartstrings, but I don't think it was really fully earned because we just didn't spend enough time with her as an individual, and we didn't get to see really who she was prior to connecting with the boys. And the other part, again, I'm kind of happy for it, but we didn't really learn anything about Paul. And reading more about the story, he kind of was very key to obviously developing this team. But again, I actually like this element because it took away saviorism. I still feel like we should have gotten to know more than just Paul Walsh, because that name means nothing to me outside of the fact that it's a character on there until I looked it up. But it was kind of cool that they blanked about. Like, he wasn't even able to come for the biggest part of the movie, which was dope because that's part of the character development. Like, it's part of the character development. So I genuinely enjoyed this movie. I actually think this was one of the better made movies, and it's my second Indian movie, and considering this is under Bollywood, it did not come off like a Bollywood movie at all. At all. I would not have expected it. If you had just shown me the movie straight up, I would have just assumed it was in the same guise as a Slumdog Millionaire or A Life of Pi, where it's just a movie that Hollywood has featuring Indians. But under its element, it calls it Bollywood Hollywood. So I guess there's a reason for the mixture. But while I would have loved to see a good dance-off, no, I think this was a great grounded movie. Definitely should recommend seeing it. I give this one a 8.3 out of 10 on this. Only reason I put it is because I don't know if it didn't have enough of a cultural impact like I feel like Invictus did. It didn't have enough of a cultural impact on the greater scheme of things because they were largely ignored because apparently at that same time, the Cricket World Cup was happening. So they didn't even get the full praise in 2007. And what they did was incredible. Like, you look through the list, they beat. Oh, I don't want to spoil it. But they're a championship team, and they took 4 months to get ready. Amazing story. I absolutely amazing story. But I don't think this one had enough of a cultural impact overall, or it wasn't presented as such. So I don't want to put it above Invictus, but it is close, in my opinion. Great movie, great story, consistent plot line, consistent character development. I think it's fully enjoyable. I don't think you feel the moment, and legitimately you feel the joy and pain from each of the kids as they go through this moment and discover themselves. Just you can find it on Amazon Prime, and definitely I had to use a VPN to get it through UK, but I think in the US you might be able to get it. But definitely check it out through there.